They don't use quilts on Everest or on Arctic expeditions, so why should you? Quilts are cold and drafty, expensive, and just not as good as the tried and true sleeping bag. I hear all kinds of reasons as to why people hate quilts, but I'm here today to give you the real reasons why quilts suck, but also provide some tips and tricks in order to fix some common issues so you can potentially take advantage of the weight and comfort advantages that quilts offer. Before we get into why quilts suck, let's go over some of the common reasons that people think quilts are great, because there's a lot of quilt users out there and a lot of people who are huge proponents of quilts. The first thing that people say is that quilts are more comfortable because it's easier to toss and turn and shift positions underneath them. And that's because quilts stay in position and are locked onto the sleeping pad using pad straps, whereas with a sleeping bag, you have to kind of turn the whole sleeping bag with you as you shift positions and toss and turn. So a quilt is going to be more similar to sleeping underneath a blanket like you do at home, and that's a big reason why a lot of people say that quilts are more comfortable than sleeping bags. The second reason that people say quilts are better than sleeping bags is weight savings, and you can't really dispute that. If you have a sleeping bag and a quilt that both have the same temperature rating, the quilt is going to be lighter just because it uses less material in order to construct it, doesn't have a zipper, and doesn't have a hood. The way quilts are constructed is that you have a foot end, which is basically like a sleeping bag. It just encompasses your entire lower leg. Sometimes they have zippers like this one so you can open it wide up, but the top half is wide open and it leads to you sleeping directly on the sleeping pad and leads us to the first reason why quilts suck. The first reason that quilts suck is that they can sleep quite cold. And there's a couple different ways that this is happening. The first has to do with the sleeping pad. Because quilts are open on the bottom and you're sleeping directly on the sleeping pad, if you have a cold sleeping pad, then you're really gonna feel that when you're using a quilt. That being said, this is still gonna be an issue when you're using a sleeping bag. As you're laying on a sleeping bag, you're compressing all the insulation in between you and the sleeping pad, and that insulation is rendered pretty ineffective because of that compression. And then when you shift positions in the sleeping bag from maybe your back to your side, all of that compressed insulation is then exposed to the air, leading to cold spots until that insulation kind of lofts up again in the sleeping bag. That's something that people don't really talk about or maybe even notice that often, but something that I've noticed a lot, especially when winter camping, when the air temperatures are very cold, -20, -30, and even -40 degrees. The nice thing about a quilt is because it stays pretty much in the exact same place because of the pad straps, you don't really deal with that compression of insulation and then exposing that to cold air around you. But quilts being cold is a common complaint, and I think a lot of that has to do with people choosing the wrong sleeping pad. My guidance is that unless you're in very hot summer conditions or winter, then to choose something with an R value in the 4 range. That's gonna keep you nice and comfortable during most 3-season conditions. If you're in very hot summer conditions, you can get away with something lower. And then if you're backpacking in winter conditions, then choose a sleeping pad with an R value of at least 7. The second way that people get cold when using a quilt is drafts. And that basically means that cold air is somehow sneaking in underneath the quilt and cooling you off. The first place where drafts can happen is kind of around your neck and shoulders. So if this is kind of wide open up here, as you kind of shift positions or move, cold air can sneak in around your neck and shoulders and cool you off. But quilt manufacturers have developed a couple ways in order to address this, and it's important to take advantage of those if you want to stay warm when using a quilt. The first mechanism is a snap that kind of snaps around your neck and holds the quilt in place. It kind of keeps the quilt a little bit more snug around your shoulders too. The second mechanism is this cinch. So it's just a piece of cord that goes around the end of the head end of the quilt, and you can tighten that up and it cinches the quilt nicely around your neck and shoulders. What a lot of people do is they kind of cinch this up a little bit or leave it wide open, but I recommend cinching it down as tight as you can, like basically right around your neck, and that's gonna seal off any drafts from this part of your body. A lot of quilt manufacturers will also offer the option of a draft tube, which is basically a tube of extra insulation around this opening at the top end. And that just really helps seal in all of your heat and keep out all of the cold air that might be around you. And I recommend getting that if you are going to be sleeping in temperatures under freezing and using a quilt. The second place where drafts are most likely to happen is along the sides of the quilt, where the quilt connects to the sleeping pad with pad straps. I have pad straps connecting the quilt to the sleeping pad right now, but there's 2 reasons why that the way I have them set up right now is gonna lead to drafts. The first mistake that I made with this setup is that the pad straps are too close together. What you want to do is have them as far apart as possible so that the edge of the quilt is nice and tight. Even just making that change, you can see that there's much less kind of distance that the quilt can rise, and there's a lot less exposure for drafts. The second mistake that I made is that the connection point for the pad straps are on top of the sleeping pad. And that's an easy mistake to make. I think a lot of people probably just throw the pad straps onto the sleeping pad, attach the quilt, and then assume that they're good to go. But people might have missed that with the clips on the pad straps, they can move along the pad straps. So the best thing to do is to move those clips so that they're right almost underneath the pad. Basically where the pad meets the ground is where your pad strap clip should be. And that makes it so that the quilt kind of wraps around the sleeping pad a little bit, not a ton, so you're not really compressing any of the insulation and you're not going to be losing a lot of space underneath the quilt. But what it allows it to do is as you kind of toss and turn and lift up the quilt a little bit, you have a little bit more leeway and travel. You can see right now, I'm just pulling the quilt as hard as I can, and there's basically no drafts happening along this edge. So if you're worried about drafts and being cold when using a quilt because of that reason, then use my tips for the head end of the quilt as well as the pad strap use, and you're gonna solve those problems and you're gonna sleep a lot warmer. Trust me on this one, I have a lot of experience with quilts. I've taken them down to minus 30 degrees Celsius and be toasty warm. But there is one more reason why quilts suck, and this one's probably the biggest reason why people don't like quilts. But before we get into that, let's talk about today's sponsor, Garage Growing Gear. Garage Growing Gear carries the quilt that's my personal favorite, as well as quilts from 5 other brands. So they're gonna have you covered no matter what kind of quilt you need. Whether it's a high-end quilt from Katabatic Gear, or a more affordable quilt from Hammock Gear, or the lightest quilt on the market from Enlightened Equipment, and my personal favorite, Garage Growing Gear is gonna have you covered. They also started carrying this really awesome repair kit from Common Gear that I love because it contains everything that you need basically to repair gear when you're out on the trail. And what's really neat about it is it's 2 secret compartments, one that has a needle in order to use with the thread that's wrapped around the top, and then this other compartment on the bottom which contains repair strips in order to patch things like down jackets or sleeping pads or sleeping bags. Go check out Garage Growing Gear and all the quilts that they have on offer at the link in the video description. I'm gonna go ultralight and get a quilt and an X-Lite and sleep on my down jacket. Is tempting to do if you want to be as lightweight as possible on your backpacking trips, but it leads to this next reason that quilts suck, and is a reason that I don't think a lot of people think about. Even if you have the best pad attachment system and are using it properly, tossing and turning all night is inevitably going to lead to drafts as you kind of move the quilt around and shift the pad strap positioning. While a few shots of cold air as you toss and turn isn't the biggest deal in warm temperatures, if you sleep cold or are backpacking in sub-freezing conditions, then that can get really uncomfortable as you get colder and colder and colder. Lightly shifting in your sleep is normal and helps with blood flow, but tossing and turning in a significant way is often a sign of being uncomfortable and having significant pressure points in your sleeping position. I started off backpacking thinking that tossing and turning due to lack of comfort was just a part of backpacking and something that I had to get used to. But since then, I've tried dozens and dozens of sleeping pads and pillows and have been really able to dial in my sleep system. And I've realized that it doesn't have to be that way. You can be comfortable sleeping in the backcountry, and while you may need to carry a little bit of extra weight, all you need is a comfortable sleeping pad, a comfortable pillow, and maybe a quilt. I do find quilts to be more comfortable than sleeping bags, but that's a personal preference thing. Let me go over what I think the key points are in order to choose a comfortable sleeping pad and a comfortable pillow, because there's a lot of uncomfortable sleeping pads out there and some nuances with pillows in order to choose one that's going to be right for you. The 2 aspects that are important for a comfortable sleeping pad are warmth and pressure relief. For warmth, a lot of the time you can just go by what the R value is. Like I said, something in the 4 range is good for most people in 3-season conditions, but take that R value with a grain of salt. I've been testing a lot of sleeping pads that have R values in the 4s, but then once I get them into real world conditions, they sleep a lot colder. So make sure you're reading reviews, maybe watching my reviews because I do test my sleeping pads extensively, and taking that R value with a grain of salt. For pressure relief, back sleepers, you're probably going to be able to get away with almost any sleeping pad out there. But if you're a side sleeper like me, then you're going to want a sleeping pad that's going to really relieve pressure, especially along your shoulder and hip. A pad like this REI Helix is going to be really good at relieving pressure points due to the way that the baffling system works. You can see that there's these raised areas and then lowered areas. Each of these raised areas kind of acts as an air spring, which really helps relieve pressure as you're laying on it. There are a whole bunch of other sleeping pads out there with similar baffling systems that are gonna relieve pressure points, like the Sea to Summit Etherlite XT, which is comfortable, but not nearly warm enough for most 3-season conditions. And then the new line of Zenbivy sleeping pads are also very similar to the REI Helix, but I find slightly less comfortable, like 5 to 10% less comfortable than the REI Helix. For pillows, there's 3 things I think you need to be looking at in order to have a comfortable pillow. The first one is some way to connect the pillow to the sleeping pad. Whether that's a pad strap like I have here or the Velcro system that Sea to Summits uses, it's really important, I think, to have some way in order to keep the pillow locked onto the sleeping pad as you toss and turn or shift positions over the course of the night. Otherwise, you're chasing your pillow around the tent, and that's gonna wake you up every single time. Whereas a pad strap, it's gonna keep that pillow in place. The second thing is the baffling system of the pillow. You want something that's gonna be supportive and not feel like you're laying on a balloon. That's a little bit harder to find, but a lot of pillows coming out these days do have pretty good baffling systems, like this X-Ped Mega Pillow, as well as this Big Sky Dream Sleeper. Even though this one's only 52 grams, it's pretty comfortable to lay on. The third thing is probably the most important, and that's pillow height. You want to be matching the height of the pillow to basically the breadth of your shoulders if you're a side sleeper. This X-Ped Mega Pillow is over 4 inches tall, so if you are someone with broader shoulders, then it's going to really keep your head kind of elevated and take a lot of the pressure off of your shoulder. Because of that, you're going to get a lot less pressure points and you're not going to toss and turn as much. This Mega Pillow is my top recommendation if you don't mind carrying a little bit of extra weight. If you want to save some weight, then the Big Sky Dream Sleeper with my custom pad attachment system is going to be the way to go. Taking these things into account with your sleeping pad as well as your pillow are going to lead to you having a much more comfortable sleep, fewer pressure points, less tossing and turning, and then less potential for drafts with your quilt system. So while there are a few different reasons why quilts suck, and I get why people are hesitant to use them, I think a lot of it has to do with just unfamiliarity. And once you get used to using a quilt and figuring out the nuances in order to how to use it properly, then they can be awesome and a great way to save some weight and add some comfort for your sleep system. That being said, I know there's a lot of people who are still gonna love sleeping bags more than quilts, especially if you're someone who likes to be cocooned inside of a really enclosed system, or you just don't want to be fiddling with pad straps and all the other things that quilts have to do in order to be comfortable and warm while you're out on the trail. Go check out this video where I go over all of the top camp pillows out of dozens of different camp pillows I've tested over the years. I go over the 5 best ones for all kinds of conditions, whether you want something for ultralight, something for side sleeping, whether you have broad shoulders, narrow shoulders. I have a pillow for basically anybody out there in order to be comfortable on trail.